Hello, everyone, and welcome again to another session at ICFJ's Global Health Crisis Reporting Forum. I'm Stella Roque, ICFJ's Director of Community Engagement based in Washington, D.C. I'm thrilled to welcome today Rick Dunham, co-director of the Global Business Journalism program at Tsinghua University. Rick has 35 years of experience as an American reporter, editor, and Washington bureau chief, and has spent a decade training and educating journalists and journalism students in the United States and around the world. He's also a former president of the National Press Club and covered the White House for Business Week magazine and the Houston Chronicle. He's here today to give you a tutorial on covering the economic implications of the COVID-19 pandemic for a local audience. Before we begin, a few quick points. If you're a journalist on Facebook but haven't joined our forum group yet, please do. Search for ICFJ Global Health Crisis Reporting Forum. If you're not on Facebook, we have a mailing list where you can sign up to receive updates on upcoming webinars. Go to www.icfj.org and scroll down and click on the Covering the COVID-19 Pandemic page. We've also got 3 great sessions happening next week. We are hosting 2 special events in partnership with the Embassy of Sweden in Washington, D.C. One, a session on World Press Freedom Day on Monday, featuring the Director General of Swedish Radio, Sila Benko, Washington Post Global Opinions writer, Jason Rezaian, and Beijing Bureau Chief for Newsweek magazine, Melinda Liu. And next Friday, joining us from Stockholm, will be Sweden's state epidemiologist, Dr. Anders Tegnell, to discuss Sweden's novel response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And Wednesday of next week, we are bringing you 3 journalists who have actually caught COVID-19 and the stories of how they got through the illness and survived. Also, please feel free to type your questions for Rick during the session into the Zoom chat, which you can open by clicking the chat option at the bottom of your screens. If you're watching from Facebook Live, type them in the comments below and the video, and we'll make sure it gets on the Zoom chat. And now for the main session, I'm turning this over to you, Rick. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you very much, Stella. And good morning, good afternoon if you're in Europe or Africa, good evening in South Asia and East Asia. I am very happy to be with you, and I will get right to it here. So let me share the screen. And get started. So our webinar today is about covering the economic implications of the coronavirus pandemic from a local point of view for a local audience. Before I start, I just want to give you a little bit about me. I thank Stella for that, that introduction. So I was a reporter, professional reporter for 35 years, plus 4 years working for the Philadelphia Inquirer when I was in college. The last 29 in Washington, I was a bureau chief, I was a White House correspondent, I was a reporter, I was an editor. I have covered a wide range of subjects, economic and political. I have particular interest in money and politics, economic policy, budget, taxes, international relations, global trade from my 15 years at Business Week. I was president of the National Press Club and Press Club Journalism Institute, where I did some journalism training along with training for International Center for Journalists, and was chair of the executive committee of the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press. So I have an interest in global free press issues as well. For the past 7 years, I've worked with ICFJ in China, the director of their China programs and co-director of Global Business Journalism, which is based at Tsinghua University, the top university in Asia. I've been a visiting professor teaching multimedia reporting, data journalism, advanced news writing, US media culture, and I recently had a textbook for multimedia reporting published by Springer. I always enjoy global training. I've done training in Asia, in Europe, and in America of international students, American students, and Chinese students. And now let's get to the topic. I want to try to pack in as much as we can, and I look forward to your questions and feedback. We can continue the discussion on our Facebook group afterwards. To start with, we've ended up with the biggest economic story of our careers. You look at the National Review headline, the World Trade Organization head warns of the deepest recession of our lifetimes. The commentary from the Financial Times, the world economy is now collapsing. This is deeper than the Great Recession of 10 years ago. A lot of comparisons to the Great Depression of 80 years ago. It's a global story. It's a global economic story. It's the biggest story in the world. It's also a national story in each of our countries. And for our local communities, our local news organizations, it's an intensely local story. So we need to cover all of those angles, and depending what kind of organization we work for, we look at our perspective a little differently. I'm going to talk today about the local angles, trying to find good business and economic stories for your local audience. So from a global perspective, we look at the impact of the coronavirus on global economy, national economies, fighting the pandemic. We were looking for stories of how to solve the problems, contain the pandemic, contain the economic fallout, and look ahead. We're looking ahead at global economic forecasts, trade, trying to figure out what's going to happen. And then finally, the global tensions that result from this, whether they're trade tensions, whether they're geopolitical tensions, whether they're economic tensions with regional problems in different areas of the world. I mean, from a national perspective, we're looking at how our nation's central government is handling the situation. And that's a huge story, no matter where you are. In fact, in almost every country, that's the biggest story, more than the global story. How is our government handling it? How are the nation's regions handling the problems? States, provinces, regions, the economic impact nationally or regionally within the world, or regionally within our country. Finally, how our nation is handling it differently than other nations in the world, right? Compare China to the United States, to Europe, to African countries, to South Asian countries, to South Korea or Japan. Looking at the future of our economy and displaced workers, damaged industries. In every country, there are certain industries that are hit most, and there are workers who are displaced. And the question is, what happens to them in the future? So locally, we look at it, and we can localize these national stories, these international stories, right? Put our local faces on the big story. We also have local economies to cover, both the macro economy, meaning, at large, how is the local economy doing? What has the damage been? What are the ways of trying to get it back to semi-normal? And then the micro economy, meaning components of it. Individual businesses, sectors of the economy, the governments, workers themselves, dealing with unemployment or underemployment. Those who are still working, what are the risks that they're facing? And then telecommuting has become a big story everywhere. Companies that have telecommuting, companies that don't have telecommuting. And finally, local consumers. How are local people reacting in terms of their buying habits, in terms of shops being open or not open, the challenges that are being faced there. So there are a wide range of local stories that we can cover. I say, what's driving stories? What factors? The first is data. So do we have data to back up our stories? National data, international, regional data, or local data? And is that sometimes it's economic data, sometimes it's health data, sometimes we're doing stories based on a combination of the two. And sometimes it's government data or non-government organizations such as World Health Organization, World Trade Organization, or private data by universities or private companies. This story that I post up here is just a very typical example about the jobless rate in Pittsburgh, taking the latest US Government Bureau of Labor Statistics numbers and writing it up. What does it mean locally? And then not just having the what, but why and how. How is it affecting workers locally? Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. Another story driver is poll or survey stories. And this can range from consumer confidence numbers. In the US, the Conference Board, there are several different measures of consumer confidence. And this is the Associated Press story on that. Or it can be polls of public opinion. This is from KXAN TV in Austin, Texas. And it's based on a poll by the University of Texas and the Texas Tribune. And it deals with the concern of people in the state of Texas about the economic problems and how they compare the economic challenges with the healthcare challenges. So it's a local story. It's based on the state of Texas. Okay, there are trend stories that are national trend, international trend, that are driven by anecdotes. You localize them. So this is from the Washington Post, and it uses a family drive-in theater in a town called Stevens City, Virginia. And it talks about how drive-in movie theaters are suddenly popular again. This is just one of those trends. It's something that has changed in the world, in the business world, because of coronavirus. So it's a really good idea. This story could be done in almost any town that has a drive-in movie theater. And it's easy to localize. It's easy to have human beings, both businesses and consumers. Okay, there are human interest stories that are driven by anecdotes. There are a lot of these stories out there right now. This is about Houston's Chinatown and the restaurants. People are not going to the restaurants to dine in. The restaurant workers are feeding frontline workers, so healthcare workers, police, fire. And this is compelling in multiple ways. One is, how are businesses surviving? The second is that there is some prejudice against Chinese Americans in some parts of America as a result of the coronavirus originating in Wuhan. And so the workers in Chinatown and Houston are trying to do this for public relations as well as economics. Another story driver is personal stories. To me, these are the best kinds of economic stories, when you have a human face. There's a website, peopleduringapandemic.com, that just has a series of these. And I think almost any local publication can talk about individual people who paint a bigger picture. So Charlie, the new employee, he got a job, and guess what? He's working remotely. He's had training remotely. My niece's husband had the same thing. They relocated during the pandemic from New Jersey to Seattle because he got a high-tech job, but everything is different. He has not yet seen his office. Or Kristen here, the furloughed fertility nurse, one of the many people affected whose job has been lost, at least temporarily. And this is her story, starting with when she got the call. Okay, another driver is crowdsourcing, right? The news outlets asking the public for their help in uncovering information and creating stories. This is from the Washington Post from this week. Do you live in a state that has reopened or is planning to reopen soon? They want to hear from you. The BBC does this globally extremely well, trying to bring in people through social media and through their websites to give information. The Dallas Morning News, my friend Beth Frierking, who is the editor in charge of verticals there, and she says that the Dallas Morning News is encouraging tipsters on whatever platforms they use to engage their readers. For them, a lot of it's their Facebook groups or in stories. They put it at the bottom of stories, and they get calls. And they base a lot of their reporting on it. As she says, we're going to hear from a lot of people, and they say, hey, this is happening here. And so the reporters from the morning news need to be ready to go and follow up. So in this time when we as reporters aren't always out and about as much as we usually are, crowdsourcing becomes a more important way to drive stories, to get leads on stories that we might normally get when we're out and about on our own. So what forms can our stories take? Data journalism storytelling is one. If you get a good data set that helps you tell an in-depth story. Explanatory journalism in this time, whether it's medical issues, whether it's healthcare issues, whether it's economic issues, unemployment, how does unemployment compensation work? How do you explain aid to the businesses, government aid to businesses that are struggling right now? Narrative journalism, take us behind the scenes of how a decision was made to open up your hometown, to close a business or reopen a business. Trend stories, there are a lot of trends coming out of this, and we just have to be on the lookout in your local community. If you hear a couple of anecdotes that are similar, you might have a trend. You might spot a trend that's local, or you might have a national trend that you've seen in national media that you can localize. I think profiles of people are so good because it puts a human face on economic issues. I always think that telling stories with faces, with people, rather than just numbers is powerful. And the same way, color stories, human interest stories during this. Sometimes opinion and commentary are useful. You want to weigh in on what's happening, whether it's your government actions, company actions, or societal shifts in the challenges for underserved communities. Obviously, investigative journalism, if you find either some wrongdoing or a topic that is right out there that needs to be looked at. And the next step beyond investigative journalism is solutions journalism, where you talk about solutions, best practices and ways companies or individuals or governments around your region or your nation or the world are solving some of these problems. Okay, we want to add value. We want to localize national trends, global trends, look for trends that haven't been covered. Occasionally you're going to see that. You have something new. You're ahead of the curve. Concentrate on underserved communities, the kind that you may not be hearing about in national media. You want to look for examples in some cases where conventional wisdom is wrong or where your community is different than the nation as a whole. And take the reader behind the scenes, those explanatory stories, the narrative stories, behind the closed doors. That always adds value if you can get a company or a government or an organization to open up to you. Help the reader understand the significance of what is happening in larger terms. If you have unemployment numbers, put it in context and localize it and look for data. Look for stories with data that can back up your points. Humans and data combined. So what are some of the keys to actually telling these stories? The first thing I say is to be analytical. 24/7 news has made information a commodity. It's very often free. We need to add value. So the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette story on unemployment locally didn't just put the number out there. They gave context to it. They did analysis. They added value with that story. More than the what, the why, the how, the what next. Ask those questions and show faces, not just numbers. I mean, there's so many stories that I see that are just really quick stories with some numbers. I don't think that those stories add very much value. I think with a little more work, you can create stories that are much more valuable. And historical context is so important right now, to compare this to past economic downturns, to compare it to past pandemics. Also to give national or global context, to compare your country to other countries around the world. Is it better? Is it worse for what is going on, both economically and in terms of the health risks? And finally, one that a lot of reporters don't think of is per capita context, because you would have the United States has the most cases of coronavirus in the world, but if you look per capita, meaning per person in the country, there are other countries where it has been a tougher hit, a bigger hit. So always try to remember that. When I looked, one of my students is doing a project on Spain. He's from Catalonia and doing a project on coronavirus in Spain. And he gave me the numbers for each of the regions of Spain. And I told him, that's not as valuable to a reader as per capita, meaning per person in those regions. Which regions are the hardest hit? Where are is the healthcare system the most stressed? So remember the context here. And Michael Golden at an ICFJ panel in San Francisco in 2017 said, the value of journalism isn't simply to relay facts, but to put those facts in context. I think at a time like this, that adds so much value. Finally, my key is visuals, photographs or photo galleries, real people, real businesses. Videos can be very useful. Podcasts to add to stories where you hear people's voices, and data visualizations and interactive graphics. So this graphic, which I took from Axios, you look at it and you can see how in the global financial crisis of 10 years ago, the money fleeing the emerging markets was deep, but this one is so much deeper and so much faster, both debt and equity. So you can see the depth of this is much worse, and the rapidity of the global decline is much faster. And this one, I think, is really good. It was from Econ Chart Twitter account. And you look at it and you can see the comparison of the amount of outflow from emerging markets in the first 80 days of the COVID crisis was more than the entire investment in emerging markets for all of last year. So you can see the rate of decline and you can see the speed of the decline. So in both of these cases, adding this data, whether you're doing a local story or a national story, it adds a lot of value. It connects with the reader on an emotional level. So let's go from some of those general theories to specific story ideas. And I hope some of these stories can help you come up with ideas or at least pique your interest to think about stories along these lines. So I start with sort of a survey for a template of your local coverage. And these questions will help you think of the level of economic distress in your community. So how deep is your national economic collapse? What are the strongest industries and your major employers, both nationally and locally? In each of these, what is the ability of each of these to telecommute? So that's service industries, manufacturing, where there are a lot of problems, versus industries that can telecommute. And how dependent are your businesses on the density in the workforce, meaning in their offices or their customers coming in large numbers together. Also, what are the weak links in the economy in the best of times? Is your local unemployment higher or lower than the national average? Do you have a large number of migrant laborers or foreign guest workers? And what was the income equality situation like before the pandemic? So depending on your answers to some of these questions, you will know how to frame your coverage, right? What is the population density of your area? Is it largely rural or is it a big urban area, right? Is it New York City? Is it New York State? Is it Dhaka in Bangladesh, or is it some of the rural areas without that kind of density? How capable is your healthcare system to weather a major outbreak? And this would apply to some countries that have not yet had major outbreaks of COVID-19 yet. And how competent is the government to enforce social distancing, to enforce shutdowns of businesses if needed? Okay, I look at stories from a local angle, first as national stories that would have a local interest. The tension between economic recovery and the health of people in the community is big everywhere. Everywhere. The first concern of most governments is the health of their people and not creating a situation that stresses the healthcare system beyond the breaking point. But at the same time, businesses want to make money. Businesses want to stay in business and people want their jobs. So there's always that tension. And that's a national story with local interest, right? Comparing this collapse to other modern downturns. the same way. It's a national story with local interest. In a lot of countries around the world, there have been issues with human rights or workers' rights, sometimes press freedom or workplace safety. So an example, in some of the small states in the United States with meat packing plants, President Donald Trump has ordered workers back to work, ordered the plants to open, even though the workers say it is not safe and that he is violating the rights of workers. So this is an interesting issue. And this is something that's all over the world. We're seeing these kinds of issues. And national issues, increase in debt, individual debt, companies in debt, and local and national governments in debt. What are the consequences of this? There are going to be long-term consequences of the current debt spiral. In a lot of the world, there already were debt problems in countries like Pakistan and many countries in Africa before this. This is only going to exacerbate, to complicate that problem. Okay, you can localize national data, GDP, unemployment. In some countries, there's better data available and more timely data available. Fortunately, in the United States and in much of Europe, you can get granular data on both of these things. And that makes for a lot of good local stories. In some parts of the world, it's harder. It's more of a challenge, and you may have to do anecdotal evidence of this. Okay, local companies working remotely. Everywhere you have examples of this. And I would think of a tale of two companies, one where workers can work remotely and one where you need workers in the building. And just to compare the challenges, compare how they're doing one to the other. In every country, there are industries or sectors of the economy that are hard hit, right? From the energy industry to primary care doctors, from restaurants to dentists. There are issues with supply chains everywhere of getting what you need. Getting what you need because international problems with supply chain, and getting what you need from manufacturers to consumers in different parts of your country. There are shortages popping up all over. And I will say there are fewer of these in China than there are in the United States. But in the United States, the breakdown in supply chains are manifesting themselves in shortages of some products, as well as issues with hoarding and price gouging. And the price gouging, raising prices of products that people want in the crisis, is something local governments are often dealing with. So you will want to look at local attempts to try to deal with price gouging. There are angles you can pursue with locally. Small businesses, right? Small businesses everywhere are taking the brunt of this. In much of the world, small business is the biggest driver of economic growth in the last 10 years, and women entrepreneurs drive small business. So both of those are good stories. Financial struggles of colleges and universities. If you have a university in your home area, most of them are struggling right now. They can do long distance learning at this point, but twice a year, universities get tuition. And if they can't be open by the time they get tuition in the fall, and if they can't charge full tuition, their economic model will fall apart. So that's a big story all over the world. Migrant workers and immigrant workers, that's an angle in almost every rural area or towns that have manufacturing plants. Supply chain workers, the same way. Truck drivers, people who get products from one point in the country to another. Lots of challenges for them. I mean, their companies are under stress, but at the same time, they need them to drive through the night to get products from manufacturers to the people who want to buy them. And I've seen stories on recent college graduates or high school graduates who are looking for jobs, who were looking for jobs before this, or started their first job and now all of a sudden they're out of work. That's a local story that you can find. Local governments have budget issues all over the world right now because they have less tax revenue coming in. How do they pay for these healthcare services? How do they give support to local businesses when their revenue is down? That's probably going to be the next wave of unemployment, is going to be local and regional governments, and perhaps eventually national governments, although national governments are going into debt right now to try to keep employment up. So local attempts to help businesses and workers, programs to try to help local entrepreneurs or even local larger businesses, and the attempt of local governments to balance safety and tax revenue to keep services up at a time where their tax revenues have gone down by, in many places, by 10% or more. So local stories include the economic impact on major local employers, sectors of the economy. So where I used to work in Houston, Houston Chronicle, obviously the oil and gas industry is a particularly big sector that has just been devastated by a combination of factors, including global demand as a result of the coronavirus. You can look at who is working or who's not on a local level, right? The challenges that families have of paying bills. Right at the beginning of the month, there's always a wave of stories because you have bills that come due, rent that comes due. So how are individuals or families or businesses coping with this? At the beginning of this month and the beginning of next month, there are probably going to be a lot of individuals and a lot of businesses who have challenges. And just on a personal note, I still own a house in Austin where I used to work. And one of the two people living in it lost his job. And I've reduced the rent by 50% so that they can keep going with a result of one paycheck and unemployment. But so it's happening on an individual level, and it's happening to people on both ends of the spectrum, the people who have to pay the bills and the people who are being paid or not being paid. So it's always a good story how local businesses that stayed open are coping with the loss of business. I mean, I've seen this with a lot of small groceries or others where there's just less business than there used to be, but they're trying to stay open. They're struggling to stay open. And then there's another type of story as countries and regions come out of the worst of coronavirus, planning to reopen. What's the new business model? How are they going to try to make it work? Can restaurants even make money if only 25% or 50% of their tables are filled? Do they have to change forever to a takeout kind of system, or at least have that as a bigger component of their business model, right? There are local stories on local companies that are changing what they make to produce something in need during the pandemic. From masks to, I've seen stories on distilleries or liquor companies, local brew pubs that are making hand sanitizer. So stories like that, or local companies donating their products to the needy, to first responders. At the same time, we have agricultural products that are being destroyed in the field because there's no one to pick them. We have more people who are hungry or who need help from food banks, right? We have local companies making protective gear or other newly in-demand products like cleaning supplies. Local businesses that had vibrant e-commerce beforehand versus some that had none at all and are now struggling. I know some of my favorite restaurants, I've looked to try to order online to help them, and they don't have a website that's interactive, versus the ones that I have that are sending me emails 2 or 3 times a week, hoping that I will buy. So the ones that were vibrant in advance of the coronavirus are probably doing better than the ones who didn't think ahead. And finally, local businesses applying for government aid. And I would say if you choose a local business as a case study and follow it through the whole process, this process sometimes is very difficult. And some companies, some businesses get money right away, some haven't gotten it. And what are they doing? What are they doing to try to survive another month until they might get the government assistance? So I say another way that journalists can help the readers is information that helps your readers, right? What are the unemployment benefits? What are the rules? Are there extended benefits? How do you get around the problems? How do businesses apply for assistance? And then I've seen this in numerous places, list of local restaurants with lists of what they're open for, dine-in or takeout or delivery, what combination, what hours, websites or phone numbers that you could call. And I saw this in my old newspaper, the Houston Chronicle, just keeping people up to date on what is happening that they care about for consumers. Limits on purchasing food items or non-food items. There have been limits all over the world on what you can buy to prevent hoarding. And so this is just an update. It's a small story, but it's a local service story, information for the readers. So let me show you a few best practices examples. And these are the kinds of things that you can do locally. Here's a New York Times story. This is a national story, but this is the kind of thing you could do in your community. Straggling in a good economy and struggling in a crisis. It talks about how many people were living on the edge without a lot of savings, and this just put them over. I mean, that over the last 30 years, corporate profits had surged. The wealthiest people had gotten much wealthier, while the middle class and lower middle class and working class had stagnated or gone down, and now there's a real struggle. And so that's a story that could be done almost anywhere, using national statistics, using global statistics on income inequality or wealth inequality, and then just humanize it. I think the Arizona Republic, newspaper in Phoenix, Arizona, has done an exceptional job on local coverage. I looked at their business coverage and almost everything was localized. Almost all of the big stories were made local. So here, supermarkets face possible meat shortages during coronavirus. They made that the local story instead of a national story. Or even something here, take out margaritas at these restaurants in Metro Phoenix. That's one of the popular trends. I know it's the case here in the Washington area where I am, where restaurants make a lot of money on drinks, and now they're trying to do takeout drinks, takeout beverages, because there is a big profit margin in that. So I think this was an excellent local story that a lot of people are going to be interested in. Also, because their bars are not open, this is how they can get a drink, a virtual bar. Or here, iconic Arizona businesses face uncertainty, seek federal help. So famous businesses that everyone in the state would know about that are in trouble right now, and it follows them. Again, you're localizing a national story, you're localizing a global story. Right, the local story, shoppers off the street, that state revenues may be in decline and local revenues. And this one uses a case study, the lottery, because there are a lot of people who go to the local store and buy lottery tickets. And that's very often how education is funded in many states. And that's going to drop significantly. That's a good local story. And we have, can homeowners get help? And then what about landlords? Right? What do you do right now if you have a challenge paying your mortgage or paying your rent? And what about on the opposite side? If you're a landlord and you have all these people who can't pay their mortgage, what do you do? What are your options? And finally, this was an attempt from the owner of certain hair salons in Phoenix to keep the companies working. It stopped rent. It is waiving rent payments so that these people can stay in business for the time being. So that kind of story. It's a business that's trying to help, a landlord that's trying to help the businesses stay in business during the worst of the crisis. Okay, USA Today did a national story extremely well about industries hardest hit by the coronavirus in the United States. They combined data and anecdotes. It was written in a readable way. It doesn't sound like a story with a lot of numbers. And it looked at these sectors for the country as a whole. These are the sectors in the United States that are the hardest hit. Now, it probably varies from country to country, and it would vary region to region. But if in your region, there are some of these kinds of companies, they're likely to be very hard hit. And every region has hotels and movie theaters, and most regions have live sports. Every region has construction and transportation, and retail. So you can look and see, these are all good sectoral stories. You can get national statistics, and in the United States, you can get regional statistics by sector. So you can see in your state, in your region, how are different sectors of the economy being hit. Another is there's so many stories on public opinion. Pew Research Center has what they call a fact tank instead of a think tank. And they broke down opinion by age. So younger Americans view coronavirus outbreak more as a major threat to finances than health. Well, it won't surprise you if you look at older people, they look at it much more as a health risk. But it was a very interesting study because it has political ramifications in the United States. Younger Americans are very anti-Trump, but they're the ones who are probably most like Donald Trump in wanting to open the economy. Whereas older Americans were strongly pro-Trump the last time, and they are opposed to what he wants to do to rapidly open the American economy. So this was just interesting. It was good numbers that led to interesting political analysis if you were covering this research. And globally, the World Economic Forum is doing a really good job of providing statistics and analysis. And this is an overall story, this is how much the coronavirus will cost the world's economy. And it's just a very good analysis story. I also say the unexpected. This was the latest economic statistics from yesterday. The Washington Post did a sectoral analysis and saw that they're ahead of the curve. Others will copy this story. That the latest unemployment numbers showed a big uptick in professional and public sector jobs being lost. This is the new trend, that you're going to be seeing more stories like this. So if you could get that latest data, look for the unexpected. Look for what's counter to conventional wisdom. So I want to wrap up with some reporting resources for you and some data resources. IJNet, I highly recommend, our sponsor here. If you look at the IJNet website and then you go to the tab for COVID-19 reporting, I think the Society for Professional Journalists, Journalist Toolbox, is outstanding. And some of the resources I'm using are from both of these, from ICFJ and from SPJ. The World Economic Forum has a really good archive of resources and information on coronavirus, both from health and from economic standpoint. There's something called Radar, and Radar is dealing with solutions. They are gathering solutions to the problems from all around the world. And there's some interesting stories there from many different countries. Global Voices is similar too, around the world. Global reporting during the pandemic. They collect stories from different countries, and it's easily accessible. Okay, in the US, there are two national resources, two news organizations that are doing a really good job. National Press Club Journalism Institute on covering coronavirus, and the same thing with Poynter Institute covering COVID-19. And they also have a newsletter, a regular newsletter on covering COVID-19. There's some Africa-specific resources from IJNet. You can find this on the IJNet site. And if somebody wants to look at this PPT later, you can click on some of these. But IJNet is looking carefully for resources specific to different regions of the world, different continents, because the problems are different and there are challenges in a continent like Africa of getting timely data and consistent data. There are medical resources all over, from the National Institutes for Health, from MIT Technology Review with more than 24,000 research papers, or New England Journal of Medicine. And the data resources include World Bank, International Monetary Fund. The International Monetary Fund has its annual or semi-annual World Economic Outlook database that they just put out, and they have special notations as a result of coronavirus on that. The World Health Organization, World Trade Organization, the WTO has specific information on tariffs on COVID-related products. The European Commission has EU economic databases and statistics. And then there's a Google Doc that's been created with verified COVID-19 data sources that you can click on, and it has a wide range of sources that you can explore for more data. Associated Press has very good coronavirus data sets. There's something worldometers.info, data.world, Global Health Security Index, and USAID has fact sheet. So again, these are global resources and data sets that you can tap into. And the Centers for Disease Control, the CDC in the US, has several different sources of information. And then here are some other useful data sets from Johns Hopkins Coronavirus, Imperial College in London, Corona Data Scraper, some more data sets, and COVID-19 Tracker, which has testing, specializes in testing data from the 50 United States plus DC. You can see also there are mapping resources. There are maps that you can use to then plug in your own numbers if you want, or you can use the numbers themselves. This is the Washington Post mapping the worldwide spread of coronavirus, and you can see it's interactive. And the New York Times has tracking global outbreak also. Both of those are really excellent resources, as well as Johns Hopkins has coronavirus map. And then Sickly has a global map with cases down to county levels in many countries. You can see where people are sick near you, wherever you are around the world. So these are mapping resources that can become helpful to you. To wrap up here, these are some European data sources if you are looking. And then I just have these data sets. These are economic data sets that very often you can find in national data and in international reports. The problems with a lot of these data sets is they're not always updated every month. And some of these, it's going to be a while before you get it. As soon as these are available, there are going to be many stories you can write, many economic stories. But in the meantime, you just have to keep looking and seeing what's the latest, what comes out every month, what comes out every 3 months, what comes out every year for these different kinds of data sets. Because it's anything could be useful, from e-commerce, energy, housing, unemployment, you name it. So to wrap up, this is how to contact me. And I just wanted to let you know, when we close out the session, ICFJ is going to be sending you a survey after the webinar, and your feedback matters to ICFJ. So the idea is we want to bring you the kinds of webinars, the kinds of sessions that are going to be the most useful and important to you. So please fill that out and not only rate this webinar, but come up with some suggestions for what you want to see us doing down the road. With that, I want to open things up to questions. I'll end the screen sharing, if I can find it. And let's go on to the chat here. So yes, I see from Beth, we have the question, would you like to share the slide deck with others? The answer is we will come up with a link for you. We definitely will share this. And I'll put it on our Facebook forum. I'll put the link so that everyone can get it, because I definitely want to do that. I put embedded links into most of the sources and resources. So yes, I want to do that so that you can get the embedded links. And if you have follow-up questions, I'll open a thread on our Facebook forum so that you can follow up with me. And I know Stella could answer this. I think that we will share a link to the recording so that people can watch this. If you're not watching in real time, you could watch it at your convenience. Okay, a question from Facebook Live. How can journalists help people navigate their own search for work and personal finances right now at a time when many are feeling desperate? That's really an excellent question. And that's one of those things that we can do to serve. I think part of what we can do is by crowdsourcing, finding out where there are job opportunities, because there are right now. And some of it is in delivery. Now that may be a step down to some people, but there are certain places that are hiring. So I think it's our job both as in terms of being reporters and crowdsourcing. I know in my home area where I live, we have a community bulletin board, which has all sorts of information. And I think that news organizations should do the same thing and be a bulletin board. So if there are jobs, you can match them with the people. I think it's our job to know what's happening in the community and to be ahead of it. And I do think this is part of the public service, not only getting people to the aid, the financial aid that there is, but getting them to jobs. So I think that's a really excellent idea. And I would just create web pages and on any social media that the news outlet has to try to be a clearinghouse, to have updated information, and then most importantly have it presented in a logical, easy to find way. So I think that it's more than just having a post on your website. It's having a dedicated place on your social media and your website that people can go to find the latest. So we have another question. What are the data trends journalists should be watching closely to be able to anticipate, look ahead to what is coming next? I want to talk about two separate things. One is healthcare. One is the number of cases and looking at that curve. In a lot of the world, we've heard about the curve and flattening the curve or squashing the curve. That's one to see, because the more cases there are, the longer it's going to take for an economy to return to normal. So I think that we have to look at that. In terms of the economic side of things, I think we really have to look at sectoral data to look at where the jobs are being lost, what companies are being hurt the most. I think we need to try to break it down too, as I was saying before about underserved communities, to look at where the most vulnerable people are being hurt, and to look and see who is losing jobs, what kinds of jobs. Are these manufacturing jobs? Are these service jobs? Are these white collar jobs? Are these government jobs? And then to tell our readers. I think that there are a lot of statistics that are leading indicators. Consumer confidence is one. I think that's a really big one for recovery or not recovery. If consumer confidence goes up, it means people will start buying again when shops are open. If consumer confidence lags, I think we will have a double dip recession or depression, where we have the first round is health related and the second round is because of decreasing demand around the world. So I think that's a really important statistic to look at, if you can see nationally or if there is consumer confidence locally. You may see manufacturing indices for manufacturers' confidence. Sometimes regionally in the United States, the Federal Reserve has regional analyses in different countries. There are both national and regional surveys of manufacturers. I know that's the case in China, both government and then Caixin magazine has its own manufacturing index. So I think these indices are early indicators of what is to come. So I think that and the hiring are two really important factors of what is happening and what is going to happen. So next up, so I say answer from Stella. We'll be posting links to the resources post webinar, and we'll get the slide deck up. So I have from Marilyn. She was saying started covering the economy in the 81-82 recession, which I remember well too. I was covering the state government in Texas when the economy crashed then, although it was minor in comparison to now. And yeah, Marilyn has covered through 1987, 1990, 91, September 11th, 2008, 9, and she says she's never covered anything as confusing and unpredictable as this pandemic. And Marilyn is covered regionally, nationally, and in print and for National Public Radio. So she really knows her stuff. She says, sadly, I've never ever seen such a tiny number of local reporters because of the layoffs. And then this leads to one of our problems, and I want to use this as a jumping off point. There are more local reporters being laid off as a result of this. It's harder than ever for us to cover it. The people who are working harder than ever to try to keep up with this at a time when they're taking pay cuts, they're being forced to furlough. Some of them are losing their jobs. There have been reporters who've been sick with coronavirus and then furloughed, so that they're losing income at the same time they've been sick, fighting and working through it. And Maryland's hometown newspaper, The Vindicator, shut down last year, and just at the time that Youngstown in northeastern Ohio needs news reporters and a news organization to tell people what to do and to help solve the problems. So, I give a shout out to all of you who are working through this for a local newspaper. And the best thing to do is stay strong. The problem in past crises is you felt you would work for a few months and then things might abate and it might get easier, but we're going to have to work really hard. I think this is like covering a war, and the war is not going to let up for months to come, and possibly even a year or years. And so I think that one of the things Marilyn didn't talk about, but I think it's good for reporters to take a look at some of the mental health resources as well, whether it's the DART Center or various outlets, including IJNet, have posted on that, how we deal with the stress and the trauma. Our own stress and trauma, our own fears of contracting coronavirus because we're out there talking to people. We don't have as much protection, and the stress of possibly losing our job at any time as we're covering this. So I know it's a big challenge, and I hope, indeed, I hope it's something that we can all overcome and we can all support each other. There's a question from Nushaiba, and it's, is there any way to report economics when there's no data available? So using stand-ins, proxy indicators. The answer is yes, and it's a lot harder. The proxy indicators would be if you don't have local data, to have national data. If you don't have national data, to have data from that region of the world or continent. And if not, use global data and anecdotally localize it. That's not the best way to do it. The best way is to have data, but I know that it's not the case. In a lot of the world, there is not local data in a timely manner. You will have to do old-fashioned reporting and anecdotally create stories. Sometimes you can do surveys themselves. I had one of my best students did a survey of 90 college students and what they're doing with their time. And she wrote an excellent data journalism piece based on this survey of 90 people. And it was a really interesting story. So she created a database because she reached out, created a survey, and got people to take it. Now, it has limitations. It's not a scientific survey, but it was interesting. You could do that locally. It takes a lot of work to do, but you can create local surveys, or you can do anecdotal reporting. Go to several different, say, drugstores, pharmacies, if you want to do a story on pharmacies, and ask similar questions and see if you find trends. I think that's the best advice I can give when there is not timely data. And you have to trust your instincts and trust your reporting in those cases. So we have a question from Eric Herbst here. What data should one use that shows balance? So in the US, Trump and many of his advocates continually indict where the facts come from. That's a challenge. And in some places, government data is considered reliable. In other cases, there are questions about government data. Is it reliable? My view is that you have to, as a journalist, use data you believe is reliable and stand by it against the criticism. There's a habit of politicians, it's not just Donald Trump, it's around the world, calling stories fake news when it's stories with inconvenient facts, where the stories are factually correct, but they're not what the leaders want the public to read, and so they call it fake news. My view is you have to be careful if there's survey data that it's from reliable sources, trusted sources, and if it's from a source with a point of view, you have to include that in your reporting and mention it. But I think it's more important than ever for us to use the data that's available from trusted sources to inform the public, whether that means that public officials, certain politicians will complain about us, will try to indict us. Facts are facts, and there's no such thing as alternate facts or alternative truths. And I think we have to be on the side of factual journalism. So let me ask Stella if we're hitting the top of the hour, if we should keep going or if we should wrap up right now. Any thoughts, Stella? So okay, we can continue if there are any other questions. If anyone has anything additional, we can continue for a few more minutes here. Okay, we have a question from Facebook Live. With lots of publications shutting space for freelancers, any tips for placing international stories? And that's absolutely true. In a lot of places, the budgets for freelancers have been cut, in some places eliminated. I think you just have to work extra hard to find out which outlets still have freelance budgets. There are a lot of websites that I have seen that are posting stories related to coronavirus. Some of the ones I mentioned in resources, I don't know if they pay. I don't know the answer there, but I think that there are still big organizations that are doing freelance. In a case like reporting in China, where people are not, where more Western journalists have been kicked out, there is more need for freelance, for reliable freelance, than at any time in recent years. But in some other countries, it's going to be a lot harder. I think that the pool of places is probably going to decrease, but I think it just means we have to redouble it. Probably that question leads to a good suggestion for a future webinar on how freelancers can find ways to place stories both in the era of coronavirus and about coronavirus in the era of coronavirus. So I'm going to take that up with my ICFJ colleagues and see if there's something that we can't do in the future. I think that's a really good idea. So I think with that, we probably should wind down. I want to say thank you very much for participating in this webinar. I hope you found it useful. I hope you can find at least one good story idea out of it or more, and some resources that can help you, whether you're covering global economic impact, local economic impact, or even the healthcare side of coronavirus. Good luck to everyone. Again, thank you for being with us, and I look forward to your answers to the survey that we have. Stay safe, stay employed, and please be in touch with our Facebook forum. Thank you. Bye-bye.